Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Matt Gagel. I am the Director of Programs at Montgomery History, and we're so glad you're here. I think this should be a great program. I know it's a nice day out, but thank you all for logging in to watch this. I think this is going to be a great presentation. Before we get started, a few quick things. First of all, as I mentioned, thank you for joining us, and also a special thank you to those who have made a financial contribution to Montgomery History. We couldn't continue to offer free programs like this without your support. And again, we're very grateful for that. If you'd like to make a donation, you can go to our website, montgomeryhistory.org, and click on the Donate Now button, and that will guide you through the process. We will do a Q&A at the end. You can use the Q&A button to send any questions, and we will get to as many of those at the end as we can. If there are technical questions, you can send those to me, and I will do my best to guide you through the process of fixing those. Next week, Ralph Buglis will be joining us to present on Offutt's Crossroads, the early history of Potomac. I think that should be a great presentation. Ralph always does a phenomenal job, and I know that'll be great. Also, this Saturday, Montgomery History will be at the Gaithersburg Book Festival. We will have a booth there with our antique vintage typewriter collection. These are items that we've deaccessioned, so they're not part of our collections, but they are being used for historic interactivity, I guess, if you want to call it that. You can come and type on a typewriter and share, bring your kids or your grandkids, whatever the situation may be, and let them know that back in the day, we didn't have glass screens. You had to physically push a button down to type. So come on out. We'll have a couple typewriters out there. It should be a great time. We'll be there all day for that. So, all right. With that, I think that's all that's happening right now. I do see someone has asked about a video. Yeah, we'll have that started in just a moment with the presentation. With that, I'm going to hand over things to Maria. Maria Day is I forget her title now. She works at the Maryland State Archives. She can give you a little more detail about her position. I'm blanking at the moment, so I apologize for that. Maria, go ahead and take it away.
Well, hello. Good afternoon, everyone, or whatever time of day it might be where you are. Thank you, Matt. My name is Maria Day. I'm the Senior Director of Special Collections, Conservation, and Library Services at the Maryland State Archives. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is vintage auto travel in the early 20th century in Maryland, but I'm going to focus a lot on the special collections, which is part of my job here at the Maryland State Archives, and I'm at the archives right now. So I'm going to share my screen and get us going. Oop, I think I need to get to the first slide. Here we go. Okay. Matt, are we good? Can we see everything?
You are good to go.
Great. Well, just starting off with the picture that you will see on the left of your screen is by Marion E. Warren, and it's a truly stunning photograph of the Bay Bridge, and that's where we're going to end up today. But first, we're going to talk about all those folks who are driving down the roads in much earlier cars. So this is part of the armchair tour you're going to get today. So just a bit more about what the special collections are at the Maryland State Archives. Most people come to the state archives to get a copy of maybe a marriage certificate, a birth certificate, find some kind of legal record very often. Sometimes they're doing genealogy, and as they get to genealogy and family history, they end up interacting with the special collections that we have at the Maryland State Archives. And we have a large variety of materials that cover pretty much every format that you can think of. And I've listed some on this slide, but also just we are the department that takes in private donations. records that are important history and culture materials of the state, but maybe not considered a permanent legal record for some reason, but they're still important. So they get kept by the Maryland State Archives. We have newspapers, we have religious records, and a variety of other materials. And one of the things I like the most is we end up with all kinds of things that really add value, give a bigger picture to the government record collections holdings. I think it adds a lot of color in the sense of both diversity and also dynamic aspects of what the state is about culturally. So one of my personal favorites are the items that are paper ephemera, or kind of like the simple commercially printed materials like postcards and menus and brochures. And so you'll see some of those tucked in this presentation. So I start with one of the most interesting bits of ephemera that kind of led to me looking deeply into how the state and how people in Maryland are looking at automobile travel, by just finding one of the earliest copies of a license that I could find, a driver's license, in the Maryland State Archives, which is in our special collections as part of a donation. These are from 1917 and 18. We also have one from 1919, same individual, although the name is printed differently in two of the cards. So that's an interesting part. But one of the things I love is this is definitely a registration for a Model T car. And you'll see on the left there, there's a sort of guide for the person receiving the license of where to put their license tag on their car, because this is of course a new thing. So now that you have a license, here's where you put your license plate on your car, and that is your driver's license also in this time period right here in the 19-teens, which I found very interesting. So there's going to be a bit about the evolution of automobile vehicles, but I love this sort of forecast of how cars might develop by a designer, Raymond Loewy, who's famous in the middle of the 20th century. Here he is in two different years. He was drawing the very earliest cars that he was aware of up to his time period and beyond. He was envisioning what the cars of the future would look like. They start to veer into aircraft looking forms, and a couple of these drawings, his 1942 set, which is on the right, is a little more practical perhaps in its design qualities. But one of the things I find so interesting is the rapid change of car technology. As soon as cars come along at the very end of the 19th century, gas-powered cars are little more than carts on wheels without a horse. Now there's a internal combustion engine, and soon it gets into all these different styles and shapes, and you will see a lot of those witnessed in some of the photographs that we're going to be seeing in this presentation. But also just know that the rapid changes in technology of cars also lead to a lot of infrastructural changes in our state. So that's part of what is driving this talk. I'm very interested in both the development of people out on the road, and also how the state responds to that. So very earliest roads in Maryland, of course, were not paved originally. In Western Maryland, there's a road that is called the Old Pike. It became the National Road, or US 40. And this is a stretch photographed before the car, I believe. It gives you an idea of what the crossing of the Castleman Bridge would have been just about at the end of the 19th century, where you start to get an interest in making sure that all that traffic is able to get quicker and quicker from the interior places to Baltimore. The National Road actually is conceived and designed by people in the early 20th century, and was critical in Thomas Jefferson's sort of vision of westward expansion. And so I give you the whole of the National Road to just give you some idea of how Maryland is really critically linked to all the interior places, you know, through West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, bits of Pennsylvania, all the way out to the Mississippi River. And so that is where commerce is visioned to go. And so it becomes very critical that people can get across the western part of our state, which is very mountainous. And as far as researchers know, one of the earliest stretches of macadamed road in the country is between Boonesboro and Hagerstown, Maryland. And that's really important because clearly early on needed to get in that mountainous district, make sure that coaches and large vehicles that are transporting resources can get into the city of Baltimore. So we're part of a critical chain here that really continues throughout the period I'm going to talk about, and it really until today as well. So you start to see some wonderful photographs being taken along the road. I like some of the postcards that are being made of Western Maryland at the time. It's the importance of this road. And I love this scene of all of the early drivers. They're probably in the very late 19-teens or early 20s, but I don't have a date for this photo of the men who are standing on this bridge abutment that is a bridge over the Monocacy River. And in fact, the bridge itself, which is right outside of Frederick, or was near Frederick, does not exist anymore. That bridge actually collapsed after some structural problems in the 1940s and was rebuilt into a much more modern style. But the abutment that you see, and you can see a modern color photo of it that the men are standing on, actually does still exist. If you exit I-70 today into the historic district of Frederick, you can see one of these abutments. Oh, and the legend was, and this is why these guys might want to be climbing to the top of the abutment here, the legend was the builders of the Monocacy River Bridge stuck a whiskey jug in the top. And so you can imagine generations of men going out to the countryside and saying, oh yeah, we'll pose with the bridge. Maybe they're wanting to see if they can find the legendary whiskey jug. But the whole shape of the bridge abutment seems like a shape of a brown whiskey jug from the time period. So that is also one of the curiosities of this. So with the Model T, one of the most important things to think about is that, you know, Henry Ford is intimately associated with the mass production of automobiles, getting more and more Americans on the roadways. And so I'm starting to see by the late 1910s and early 1920s, more and more historical photos of multi-generational families going out to the countryside, clearly interested in recreation. This isn't business. This is clearly a family out on an outing of some kind, and I'm seeing at least 3 generations in this photo, if not maybe 4. And I don't know who the family in the photo is. If anyone knows, please let me know. But I just love the importance of the car as part of the posing of this photograph. And there's actually other cars behind, and the dress of the woman standing on the far right hand part of the background of this photo leads me to believe this photo might be around 1920, just because of her hat and garb there. So I'm interested also in how the state responds to more people being out on the road. So I looked into the history of how the state and local and federal governments began to regulate roadways, because that tells you a lot about how people are traveling around the state. So in 1904, the General Assembly created a law that every owner of a motor vehicle had to apply to the Maryland Secretary of State's office to get a driver's license. So before 1904, if you had a car, you didn't have to have a license. But by 1904, that changes. And then I showed you the Model T photo with some of the early licenses from the 19-teens. The state's Roads Commission, who is famous for printing lots of maps of the state, but also did many other functions related to the governing of roadways. They come about in 1908, so just 4 years later, and they are successors to some of the duties that the Maryland Geological and Economic Survey team had prior to them. So the State Roads Commission takes on the care and feeding of roadways. And by 1910, the General Assembly then established a commissioner of motor vehicles. So remember how I said the early licenses you had to apply to the Secretary of State's office? Well, by 1910, it's the commissioner of motor vehicles who you apply to. And of course, that's the forerunner of today's motor vehicle administration. So already over 100 years old. So here's one of the covers of a map of the Mid-Atlantic region that I really love from the Automobile Club of Maryland, and a photo of people broken down on the road because, of course, you had to be very much your own mechanic and pretty adventurous when you were driving around in the 1920s, which this photo takes place. Motorists on the roads, more of them, and on the road for different purposes. The state really needs to maintain its roads, and automobile safety is important. And you start to see a lot more publication of materials advertising travelers who are going on the roads for recreation. So that's why I picked this 1920s improved highways map, because I really am interested in, now people are, expected, if you are middle class, probably white, and a little bit extra well-to-do, have some extra spending money, you might have a car and you might be using that for recreational purposes. So you start to see a lot more of the tourist literature develop by this time period. And I love that I found an article in The Sun from 1921 where a travel writer got very excited because, as they wrote, in 4 hours, a motorist can travel 150 miles from blasting heat to blankets over the concrete and Macadam National Road into a land of mountains and beauty. So clearly 150 miles outside of Baltimore was a whole different world in the 1920s. And so it's very different than how we think about the roads today. So the state really had to work on building highways rather quickly. And I've talked a bit about what was happening out in Western Maryland in that really significant east-west route. But all around the state in the 1920s, the State Commissioner of Roads and other important officials are looking at ways they can improve infrastructure, both for commerce and personal travel. And this is the center section of something that is a photograph that is about 3 feet wide, and it highlights the dedication of the Crane Highway Monument in Upper Marlboro by Governor Albert Ritchie. And what I love is here in this photo, which is a sea of people that they got out, they are dedicating this monument in the start of building this highway. So it was such a big deal that the highway had begun to be built between Southern Maryland and Baltimore. So that is what is happening in this photo. So obviously there's people with instruments and bands and all kinds of sea of people here, and really the only cars I see are way in the background. So this is just such a significant thing for Southern Maryland that it seems everybody is out to hear the governor's speech as a new gateway to Southern Maryland is being proposed and begun to be built. some of the photos of early travel always leave me with some questions and some interesting stories. And I looked at these two African American men who are serving as chauffeurs as in the description that I had. And I thought, well, they're chauffeurs. Yes, they're dressed that way. And so that's obviously the role they're playing here, but there's something interesting about these vehicles. So I started talking to a local historian, and he was able to confirm that these are actually Ford fire trucks. And the way you know that is you can see that there are some lanterns in the back of the cars. There's hoses behind the drivers and other kinds of equipment that definitely are associated with automobiles. And as more of the story came out, unfortunately, I don't know the name of these gentlemen, but I do know that they are in the capacity of serving as drivers, ferrying tourists who are coming to the local train station and stopping and being transported by these drivers to the community of Sherwood Forest, which is a resort community in early 20th century Annapolis area. It's actually outside of Annapolis. And so I still don't know very much about this, but we do know that the community did not have any other community cars. So the fire trucks were doing dual duty. And my question is, I wonder if the chauffeurs were also firemen, and I would love to be able to prove that. But right now, this is as much information as I have about these gentlemen as I could find. But it wasn't before too long where some people were getting really adventurous on the roads. They weren't just driving locally or from the train station to a community. They were really headed on an adventurous trek on the road. And through again another historian who I spoke with, I learned about Helen Hubbard Lawton and her family. So these folks were actually residents of DC, spent a lot of time in Maryland, had a lot of family connections in Maryland. But what I understand is that Helen Hubbard Lawton, who's featured in the dark dress in the middle of this photo, and her mother, who is wearing the white sweater next to her, and her two children, ventured out onto the road in 1916 in August to visit family in Maine. And so I was curious about some of the photographs of this family adventure. Quite a long trek in 1916. You can see the photo below has the touring Maxwell car with a trailer being hauled behind it, which has a lot of their equipment, which would help them camp out along the way. And in fact, the touring Maxwell car, I learned through the course of my research here, is that Mrs. Lawton was not the only woman who was curious about getting this car. Apparently, this car was being marketed to the suffragist driver, and especially so after the Maxwell Briscoe Company actually encouraged and supported a woman named Alice Ramsey to drive coast to coast in one of their cars, thus making the idea of women's independence even more visible. And she was entertained and wined and dined across the United States on this epic journey, which is documented in the newspapers. And the Maxwell Briscoe Company also started hiring women to sell their cars to other women. So this was a big deal because it means that early on in the 20th century, the idea of independence and the automobile starts to become associated with women's independence in an interesting way that I had not known much about before this research. But the curiosity here is, how does a woman and her family from Washington, D.C. get all the way up to Maine? Well, if you look closely at this blueprint, which is actually what they used to document their journey, I hope after the fact. I don't know if they mapped it out beforehand or not. But anyway, this is the map that was handed down in the family, and all of the red lines, and I'll have a close up here in a moment. All of the red lines are where they stop for the night along the way on their drive to camp out. Remember, they're camping out, no hotels in some of the more distant places. And they ventured up in a round trip whirlwind tour of the upper part of the Mid-Atlantic East Coast area to visit family in Maine and back again in 2 weeks in August of 1916. They camped by the roadside most of the time, weren't staying at hotels. So you can see some of their outfits set up here with the car, even in one of the photos. And here's a close-up of the Maryland area showing a couple of these campsites that they stopped at for the evening. And you see Camp 1 and Camp 2 listed there, and then the red line. I wanted to show this portion because I'm interested in the way that Route 1, which is most likely their correct route through the state of Maryland up to the point at which Maryland and Delaware and Pennsylvania all meet. Route 1, US 1, would be the way you would drive. And today, of course, that is mirrored by a very similar route, although it crisscrosses it now, of I-95 North. So the way you would travel through the state, the parts of the state you would travel through have not really changed in 100 years, but it's the type of road that you are on that has changed dramatically. So some wonderful postcards are in our collections that show different aspects of places you might go, places you might be entertained. And one of the things I love is I encountered a Standard Oil Company booklet that was handed out at gas stations called Know Your State, Maryland. And I'm thinking that this company is also making ones for all the other states people might drive through. But one of the things I love is that this is not necessarily a tourist guide written specifically for the adult traveler, but rather it's very much has whimsical illustration, as you can see by the back cover. And the beginning of the text especially has a fairly sing-songy rhyming quality to it, which makes me believe that this book's audience was actually the adult reading to the children in the back seat and trying to get them interested in the journey and what must have been at the time a fairly long and arduous journey if you're going across a whole state in 1925 by car. No air conditioning, remember, and other things like that that we have become accustomed to in the 21st century. Where were people going? I looked at a lot of the state park system and its parallel journey into infancy and development, along with all of those state roads and other agencies that are being developed in the early 20th century. There's some significant portions of land, including Garrett State Forest and other state lands that are added and in the early 20th century. And a man named Fred W. Besley is in 1916 appointed to be the first state forester. And he's very involved quickly with making sure there are facilities for all of the people who are traveling across the state, both to learn about the parks and also and how to care for them, but also to encourage people to come out and stay in cabins or in tents. And he's very much part of the masterminding of expansion of the park some decades later in the 1930s and into the early 1940s as part of the Civilian Conservation Corps. A lot of the Works Progress Administration programs under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt really expand a lot of infrastructure along highways, not just in Maryland, but throughout the country. There's even another group called the Maryland Writers Program that's part of the Works Progress Administration that creates one of the earliest kind of comprehensive guide to Maryland, featuring photographs taken by photographers around the state, travel writers. Remember, all of these people were out of work from the Great Depression. And so the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Maryland Writers Program, these are projects to get people back into the workforce, doing the jobs that either they are familiar with or training them to do jobs so that they have job security and they can build on their skills that they learn as part of these organizations. So this is all somehow a parallel development in the state. I want to point out parks and recreation kinds of activities that are happening. This wonderful idealistic view of Chesapeake Beach, showing a roller coaster and a stretch of beach. I really love it, but I also want to think about it as being not you can't see everything here. And what I'm saying by that is there are no people of color on this beach. There's no diversity in a lot of the photographs taken at this time. People of color would not have been welcomed on a beach like Chesapeake Beach. So remember that this is a time period where there is significant discrimination and segregation. So that these photographs really have to be viewed in context of the larger part of American history. Now, there are scholars, including Candace Taylor, who've been doing tremendous work on the places that African-American tourists were able to go safely and comfortably in the early 20th century. And Candace Taylor's research with the Smithsonian recent exhibit on this famous green book, and they've all been digitized now, so it's wonderful. You can find out the businesses, the hotels, the service industry, the restaurants, and the tourist sites that were welcome places for African-American tourists and families in the early 20th century. And they start being published in New York City, but very quickly expand nationwide. Very important publication, and well worth looking into if you're interested in this time period. But I am going to focus on one of the places that was an incredibly important site of recreation for African Americans. And indeed, I think it influences other more widespread culture as well in the early 20th century. That's Carr's Beach and its accompanying sister beach, Sparrows Beach, both created by two sisters from Anne Arundel County, Elizabeth Carr Smith and Florence Carr Sparrow. It really put Annapolis Neck on the map as an entertainment venue for African Americans, where they could go and during Jim Crow not experience the kind of segregation and discrimination they were experiencing other places. They could go have reunions with family and hear some of the best top-notch performers of the era. And every weekend there was a live broadcast on WANN by Hoppy Adams as MC. And these broadcasts on WANN made the careers and supported the careers of some of the most important names in the entertainment industry in the time period, and reached a lot of ears, not just the African-American community. So you can imagine having gone to Carr's Beach at this time and hearing Billie Holiday sing, Duke Ellington's band. You could hear Chuck Berry, James Brown, Fats Domino, Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, so many important big names in the culture of the middle of the 20th century, really flocking to Annapolis Neck because of this amazing tourist venue of Carr's and Sparrows Beach. And I also looked at, as we get into some of the civil rights era, I was curious about what kind of maps the state was putting out in terms of the centennial of the Civil War. I was a little concerned maybe that there would be a tourist map that would be maybe, I don't know what I expected, but then I looked at this map and I'm seeing some attempts to be neutral, if anything else, because I see Frederick Douglass's portrait looming large over there in Talbot County, but I'm also seeing the route that John Wilkes Booth flees through Maryland into the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd in Southern Maryland. And there is a sort of, at least journalistic quality to this particular State Roads Commission map, which is framing a little bit of sites for pretty much anybody who might be traveling through Maryland in a sort of broad and in the terms of the time, I think they are attempting to be balanced, and that would be different today, obviously. But I was interested to see that sites of both the North and South are featured. This is Maryland's very complex history, and the state trying to grapple with acknowledging that history in the 1960s. And in the middle of the 20th century, you start to get specific buildings that become very iconic along the roadways. I pointed out two in these two photos: service stations like the one on the right. You see that formula, that shaped building along the American roadways so often in mid-century photos. You rarely see any of these buildings survive today, or most have been so modified they don't exist anymore in that way. And there are very few of the original style lodgings of, say, the Castleman Inn Hotel in Grantsville, but that one is still there. But there are other buildings that have very similar qualities, where some people would stop at a hotel roadside, and they all kind of had a kind of iconic shape that I see time and time again in various mid-century photographs. So we're reaching the end of my presentation here, but I wanted to end with what I think is one of the most significant changes that makes visible change in the roadway system of Maryland, and that's the building and construction of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. Not always everyone loving the idea, because there certainly are people on the Eastern Shore who feel very strongly and understandably about the changes, even these generations later, the changes that it made to build that bridge some 60 years ago. We're actually celebrating the 60th anniversary of the bridge this year. The first span was built in 1952. And in addition, it's interesting because now there's talk of having to expand the bridge again, right? Well, why the big deal? This bridge changed the way people flowed through the state of Maryland and their access to the ocean. And now today, people don't think about it so much. You just get in the car. But in the middle of the 20th century, when this was built, there's a tremendous need in some people's minds that there be greater access to the beaches. And so that's where the dream of Governor William Preston Lane starts to become a reality. And the bridge is finally built in his successor, Theodore McKeldin's tenure as governor. And this is the dedication motorcade in July of 1952. And what I have for you are a couple of audiovisual clips that might be interesting. And this one I will play briefly is the opening of the film. This film, by the way, was made by the company Bethlehem Steel that created all of the girders that built the bridge.
During a colorful ceremony on July 30th, 1952, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, which for decades had been a dream in men's minds, was formally opened to traffic. This graceful steel structure, more than 4 miles long, spans the bay about 5 miles north of Annapolis, between Kent Island on the east and Sandy Point on the west. Built as a highway connection to join western Maryland with its eastern shore, it also serves as a link in the north-south express routes bypassing the metropolitan centers of Baltimore and the District of Columbia. The opening of the bridge to traffic marked the passing of the familiar ferries which formerly plied between both shores. Along with the bridge came intrastate route changes that were planned to shift the flow of traffic and speed the traveler on his way.
Now, I wanted to point that out as important, the idea of the interstate routes, and the way that this is visualized so that people are not having to go around Washington and Baltimore, but can travel to the east this way. So that is one of the important things that the federal highway money that is being used to create these interstates goes into. And in fact, with the Bay Bridge, forget exactly what the numbers are. I mean, there is money raised, like there's a famous pennies for lane where school children were supposed to help donate pennies to much to the regret of many teachers and other adults, were donating money to help build the Bay Bridge, pennies for lane. But it became considered very, it was Governor Lane's detriment later on when he campaigned again for governor, and he did lose in that second time around. But the expansion of the highway system with federal money was considerable. There's a second piece to this film, which is at the very end, and it shows some of the formal celebrations, which I love. So I'm going to play a little piece of this.
Awaiting dedication on July 30th, 1952, the Bay Bridge, an overwater highway to the motorist and landmark to the mariner, stands out in bold relief against the Maryland sky. As tuneful music replaced the staccato sound of the riveting hammers, state officials and guests, representatives of the designers and the builders of the bridge, gathered to participate in this historic event. Through television, the unseen audience witnessed, along with those present at the dedication exercises, Maryland's Governor T.R. McKeldin, assisted by former Governor W. Preston Lane, Jr., officially opening the bridge for service. And so, another Bethlehem-built bridge takes its place among the greatest structures ever conceived for the convenience of the travel-bent and the business-bound motorists. To that end, Maryland has, at last, united its eastern and western shores as steel spans the Chesapeake Bay.
So there you have it, the modern marvel of engineering. And it's interesting that the theme here in the spanning east-west is sort of an echo of what's happened at the beginning of the talk when we were talking about Western Maryland. Oh, let me try to get it to go to the next slide. There we go. So by 1960, there were 22,032 miles of public roads in Maryland. This is according to government reports at the time. And it's really the Federal Highway Act that enables the full realization of a lot of the highway system that so many Marylanders use today to get around the state. And it's hard to imagine a world, if you think of people today trying to get places taking even more time than it takes now. We all think of our highway system as very crowded, but without those flat, smooth roads, the travel between places was so much longer. So I'm not necessarily arguing for one side or the other, but I'm saying that the landscape of travel through Maryland changed dramatically in just a very short time period from the beginning of the 20th century to the middle of the 20th century. An enormous expansion and an enormous change in our culture and our way of thinking about how we move in the world. So with that, I will stop sharing my slides and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Okay, Maria, thank you so much for that great presentation. I really enjoyed it. Video clips are always exciting, and that accent was just like, I forget what they call it, but it's the perfect accent for describing it. Always makes me smile. So
very much sounds like all the newsreels of the time period when I hear that announcer voice.
it just gives you like a real sense of pride. It's I don't know, always gets me. All right, so let me jump right into the questions and comments here. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A button. Not a lot at the moment, but please feel free to ask away. Tiffany Ahalt, who I believe she works for the Hagerstown tourism department, or Frederick County, or so, I can't remember exact position. She works up there. She mentions that the Jug Bridge Monument is located near the Frederick City Airport. So it is, you can certainly go visit that. And then Steve asks, he says, your 1933 State Roads Commission map shows the roads numbered, many of them still the same. How early did Maryland adopt numbering as a system for identifying roads and routes?
Oh, that's a great question, Steve. I don't know the exact answer, but from what I was looking at with all the different time periods of maps, it seems to develop right at about the same time that the State Roads Commission starts to I feel like it's like right at the end of the 1920s when they are starting to create all of these major highways. Like I showed you the opening of the Crane Monument or Crane Highway Monument dedication is in the early 1920s. I feel like it's the time period from 1925 to 1935 when all of those road numbers start to solidify and be assigned. And I think it has to do with the expansion of the roadway system, and it is something that's happening at a state government level.
Okay. Someone asks, with the recent closing in relative terms of the White's Ferry crossing, it made me wonder if there were any other car or vehicle ferries in the past. Besides the American Legion Bridge and Point of Rocks, Marylanders and travelers have few alternatives.
Yeah, the ferry system situation has changed so much. And when I gave this talk on Kent Island, I was a little bit nervous. I'd already talked to some folks over there. But yeah, I am not an expert on ferries. I'm sure there are others who may be, but I do feel like there are certainly a lot fewer of the car vehicle carrier type ferries in the state now. It's definitely a dying industry as far as I can tell. And I see photographs going to about the 1950s, and then I see a lot fewer photos of car ferries represented in the collection after that.
Okay. Someone asks, are the photos and records digitized and available to use in publications such as Auto Club newsletters?
Yeah, so we do have a lot of material that is digitized already. Other things, someone might come here to do research and request to be digitized. If it isn't scanned already, depending on the material, there may be a fee involved. But we do have a lot of material that's readily available of our historical photos already online. And those would be kind of from the 19th century up to the middle of the 20th century. But our special collections are so big. So I always recommend that if people are looking for something in particular, they should either ask a question by email to our help desk, and it'll find its way to me or my colleague, or to search our guide to special collections, because all kinds of things may come up, totally alternative things to what I found when I was just doing a quick search of the collection, or even over a time period. I've found so many different kinds of things related to automobile transport. So yes.
Okay, tied in with that, can you provide us with your contact email again, or the best way to get in touch with you?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. I guess I can put it in the chat, right? Okay.
You could actually, yeah, if you want to
Yeah.
drop it in the chat,
can
that
do
should
that.
be visible. So if you, those of you who are attending, you should have the chat button. It is disabled for responses, but you can click on that to see her email
My
address.
email address.
Yep,
Sure.
maria.day@maryland.gov. And if you missed that or you can't find it, you can always reach out to me. Just reply to the registration email for the Zoom, and that'll come to me. Okay, I apologize. I'm going to cough again here. Do you know what the initial toll on the Bay Bridge was?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't. I do not, but I know that we will have a government publication that will say that. If that's a topic you're interested in, my colleagues and I could probably try to help figure that out. But I'm sure it's in one of the State Roads Commission reports.
Okay. Someone says, I apologize. I arrived a little late, but I really enjoyed your discussion of the Helen Hubbard Lawton and connection with Alice Ramsey. In your research, did you come across any other famous female motorists from Maryland from that period?
No, I didn't, but I am sure they were out there. As I began to look into Mrs. Lawton's journey, I really thought she was kind of an outlier, but I was starting to read about more and more women who were very much the independent driver in the 19 teens and early 20s. So my suspicion is that there were many more people, and that, of course, Alice Ramsey was sort of being given a commercial promotion to drive across the country. So of course her name appeared in newspapers and so forth. But I bet there were plenty of other women out there who were seriously taking to the road as Mrs. Lawton did.
Okay, and I have a few people access the chat, so I'm going to type it in the as a response here, so it should be visible to everyone. And I also included the link to the state archives, and I will type that here as, give me just a moment, folks. Someone mentions, see, wait a minute, I lost the question. Oh, here it is. Okay. This is Tiffany Ahalt again. She's from the National Road Heritage Foundation in Boonesboro. Did you come across anything related to the Good Roads movement and the significance of cyclists in Maryland?
No, I did not, but I did not try. I did not, when I was doing this research now quite a few years ago, focus specifically on cycling, but that's a whole different interesting story that I'm sure would be fascinating to pursue. And I've never heard of the Good Roads movement, but that doesn't mean anything, because I am not, when you work at the state archives, you become you get a little bit of knowledge in a lot of different things, because that's the role you have in trying to help people find information. So I'd love to know more about the Good Roads movement. So hopefully there will be others who are out there doing that research who could advise me.
Okay. Someone asks, have there been any car races or race car tracks in Maryland in the early 1900s? There were recent races in Baltimore and sports car races in DC in the early 2000s.
Another good question, and I don't know. And I know that there are I feel like there are some early race tracks that are in Southern Maryland that I have seen references to, but that is just a vague notion, because it's not ever something I have done research on myself. So again, another great angle. There's so many different ones to be had on topics related to the automobile.
Okay. Someone says the 1933 state map shows what looks like the beginnings of the Baltimore Beltway. Do you know if the current Beltway follows that route?
I don't know if it specifically does, but I agree with you there. I'm definitely interested in the way that very early on there were some decisions being made at the state level as to where roads would be. But I do think that not all of those decisions were made until the 1950s. Particularly Governor McKeldin presided over a lot of the infrastructure decisions ones that were made in the 1950s. And some of the leaders like Lane before him were heavily involved as well. But a lot of the interactions of state and local officials changed the way roads were drawn. And of course, we also know that in some cases, sadly, it also broke up important neighborhoods, sometimes from disadvantaged communities, not having a say or a seat at the table. So it would be interesting to know more about that. And it's again, it's not something I've ever personally pursued, but there are government records, particularly in the government publications, that would talk about some of the decision making. And certainly the governor's own records from the middle of the 20th century would hold some of that information as well.
Okay, well, we're going to start wrapping things up here. I just have a few comments here that people have mentioned. First of all, a gentleman says a man named Robert Bruce wrote a travel log detailing a trip he made in 1915 along the entire length of the National Road in Maryland. Lots of fascinating details.
Oh, wow.
So good resource there. Another person mentions taking a national road from Baltimore to Pennsylvania beyond Grantsville, very scenic. And then another person mentions that there's some historic photos at Swallow Falls State Park to show a lot of the early pioneers of traveling. So
yes, Henry Ford, you're right. Harvey Firestone and Thomas Edison, there are famous photos. We actually have some copies of them. Of course, they exist in several different collections out there because they're photographs. But yes, I'm very familiar with those photos. And, you know, can you imagine what the captains of industry might have been saying in their outing in Western Maryland back in that time period? Those are really great photos.
okay, well, as I said, we're going to start wrapping things up. I do have a comment here, multiple comments I've seen saying thanks for the great presentation, and I agree with that. Was there anything you came across in your research that didn't quite fit into the narrative but you thought was really interesting that you can recall?
Oh, wow. Yes, and I ended up having to narrow down things quite a bit to fit a 40-minute, roughly 40-minute time piece. I will say that there are an incredible number of postcards that if you were interested in pursuing, you know, how tourist sites were viewed over a period of time, the postcard collections that that my archive has and that some of the other, I'm sure, institutions in Maryland have would be an interesting way to study what different places were, how they advertised themselves. That was kind of a whole cul-de-sac of information that I thought, wow, I could include all of this, but I ended up not being able to include very much at all about postcards. There's also a bunch of wonderful menus that I've discovered from different restaurants and hotels in this research, but again, not enough time to place all of them, but they're all in special collections, and people can consult with these records in a regular research appointment. You don't have to be special. You don't have to be writing a book. You can just be an interested member of the public and come and view some of these historical materials.
Okay, well, I'm sure you'll be getting some research requests very soon.
Great.
So with that, oh, someone just mentions there was a motor racetrack at the Rockville Fairgrounds in the that ended around the early 20s. So
yeah, I had to think that was, you know, I not being an expert in road racing, it just seems like as soon as you get a new type of vehicle, somebody wants to hold a race and compete. So I am not at all surprised. I think that's a fascinating topic and that people should research and write on that. I would encourage it.
And contact me and we'll do a presentation on it. So, okay, well, with that, we are going to wrap things up. As a reminder, we do post a recording of these programs on the Monday afterwards. They're available for 1 week. So you can certainly check that out if you missed the beginning, and feel free to share it with friends. And with that, I hope you'll join us again next week. And I just extend again my thanks to Maria for the great presentation. And I hope everyone enjoys the nice weather today. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.